The neon sign of Murphy's Diner flickered against the desert night as Sarah pulled her Harley into the gravel parking lot. She looked like any other woman stopping for coffee, shoulder-length blonde hair, worn leather jacket, nothing that screamed danger. But the three men smoking by the entrance saw an easy target. "Hey, sweetheart, riding alone?" The biggest one, Tank, stepped into her path. His friends laughed as he grabbed her arm. "Maybe you need some real men to keep you company." Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that should have been a warning. "You really don't want to do this?" Tank squeezed harder. He had no idea he'd just put his hands on the old lady of Marcus Reaper Rodriguez, president of the Desert Wolves MC. He didn't know about Sarah's black belt in Krav Maga, or that 12 heavily armed bikers were currently riding toward this exact location for their weekly meet. Most importantly, Tank had no clue that some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Sarah's expression remained calm, almost serene, as she studied the three men. Tank stood well over 6 feet, his beer gut straining against a stained tank top. His breath reeked of alcohol and poor decisions. To his left, a wiry man with track marks dotting his forearms fidgeted nervously. The third member of their little crew kept glancing toward the highway, clearly the lookout. "Last chance," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying just enough edge to make the nervous one take a step back. Tank's grip tightened. "Listen here, bitch." The words died in his throat as Sarah's free hand shot up, her palm connecting with his nose in a sharp upward strike. Cartilage crunched audibly as blood exploded across his face. Before he could react, she twisted her captured arm in a fluid motion that broke his grip and sent shooting pain up his shoulder. "Jesus!" Tank stumbled backward, both hands clutching his ruined nose. "You crazy!" The wiry man lunged forward, producing a switchblade from his pocket. Sarah pivoted smoothly, catching his wrist and using his momentum against him. She drove her knee into his solar plexus while simultaneously wrenching the blade from his grasp. He collapsed, gasping and retching in the gravel. The lookout decided he'd seen enough and bolted toward a rusted pickup truck parked in the shadows. Tank, blood streaming down his shirt, pulled himself upright with murder in his eyes. "You're gonna pay for that." He reached behind his back, his hand emerging with a snub-nosed revolver. Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, listening to something the three men couldn't yet hear, the distant rumble of approaching motorcycles. "You know what your problem is?" she asked conversationally, as if Tank wasn't pointing a gun at her chest. "You see a woman alone and think she's helpless. But what if she's not alone? What if she's exactly where she's supposed to be, meeting people you definitely don't want to meet?" The rumble grew louder, becoming a full-throated roar that seemed to shake the desert floor. Tank's confidence wavered as headlights appeared on the horizon, moving fast. "So here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued, straightening her leather jacket with practiced ease. "You're going to put that gun away and apologize. Then you're going to get in your truck and drive away, and we'll pretend this little misunderstanding never happened." Tank's hand trembled slightly, but he kept the gun raised. "You think I'm scared of some biker wannabes?" The motorcycles were close enough now that individual engines could be distinguished from the collective thunder. 12 bikes, riding in perfect formation, their riders dressed in full colors. Even in the darkness, the Death's Head patch of the Desert Wolves MC was clearly visible. "Wannabes?" Sarah laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Oh, honey, you have no idea what's about to roll into this parking lot." The lead bike peeled away from the formation, its rider, a mountain of a man with graying hair and arms covered in tattoos, bringing the machine to a stop just yards away. The patch on his back read "President" beneath the club's colors. Marcus Reaper Rodriguez removed his helmet and surveyed the scene with eyes that had seen too much violence to be impressed by small-time thugs with big-time attitudes. His gaze swept over the blood on Tank's face, the man writhing in the gravel, and finally settled on his wife. "Everything okay, darling?" His voice carried the kind of calm that preceded storms. "Just having a conversation about respect." Sarah replied sweetly. I was explaining to these gentlemen why it's important to keep their hands to themselves. The remaining 11 bikers had formed a semicircle around the diner's entrance, their engines now silent, but their presence filling the desert air with tension thick enough to cut. Tank's gun hand shook violently now as the full weight of his mistake crashed down on him. The chrome of Tommy Crusher, Volkov's Harley-Davidson, gleamed under the fluorescent lights of Rico's all-night diner as he pulled into the gravel parking lot. At 6'4", with arms like tree trunks and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months, Tommy commanded respect wherever his boots touched ground. The leather vest stretched across his broad back bore the colors of the Devil's Backbone MC, California's most feared motorcycle club, and below that the single word that made grown men step aside, President. But tonight, something was wrong, dead wrong. Tommy had been nursing a whiskey at the clubhouse when his phone buzzed with a text from Elena. She always sent him a good-night message when she worked her volunteer shift at the women's shelter, usually something sweet about getting home safe. Tonight's message was different. Just 3 words, Rico's Diner. Now. Elena Martinez didn't scare easy. In the 15 years they'd been together, Tommy had seen her face down everything from rival gang members' wives to aggressive cops to his own club brothers when they got too rowdy around her. She was steel wrapped in silk, and if she was asking for help, someone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The diner's neon sign buzzed and flickered as Tommy killed the engine. Through the large windows, he could see Elena sitting in their usual booth, her dark hair falling across her face as she stared down at her hands. Even from a distance, he could read the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself when she was fighting to stay calm. The bell above the door chimed as Tommy entered, his heavy boots announcing his arrival on the checkered linoleum floor. The night shift waitress, a tired-looking woman named Dolores, glanced up from wiping down the counter. Her eyes went wide when she saw him, and she quickly looked away. Smart woman. Elena lifted her head at the sound, and Tommy's blood turned to ice. A purple bruise was already forming along her left cheekbone, and her bottom lip was split. But it was her eyes that told him everything he needed to know. They held the flat, dangerous calm that came after someone had pushed her past fear into pure rage. "Baby?" Tommy's voice was barely above a whisper as he slid into the booth across from her. His massive hands, scarred from decades of fights and engine work, reached across the table to gently cup her face. "Who?" "3 of them," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tremor Tommy could hear underneath. "Young guys, maybe early 20s. They were high on something, meth, maybe cocaine. I was leaving the shelter around 11, walking to my car when they cornered me in the alley behind the building." Tommy's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. The Devil's Backbone controlled a 12-block radius around the women's shelter. It was neutral ground, sacred ground. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that Elena Martinez was untouchable. "They wanted my purse first," she continued, absently touching the split in her lip. "When I told them I didn't have any cash, one of them, skinny kid with a spider tattoo on his neck, he got angry, started saying things about what they could take instead of money." The booth's vinyl upholstery creaked as Tommy's hands slowly curled into fists. Around them, the diner had gone completely silent. Even the coffee maker seemed to have stopped gurgling. The other 2 held me while Spiderneck tried to drag me deeper into the alley. That's when I need him hard enough to make him sing soprano for a week. Despite everything, a ghost of a smile flickered across Elena's face. They didn't expect me to fight back. "But you got away," Tommy said, though it came out more like a question than a statement. "I got away," Elena confirmed. "But Tommy, they know who I am now. When I was getting in my car, Spiderneck yelled after me, said he knew I was Crusher's bitch and that they weren't afraid of some old man on a motorcycle." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. In the kitchen, something metal clattered to the floor, followed by hushed Spanish curses from the cook. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his mind already working through possibilities, connections, consequences. The devil's backbone had rules, and the first rule was simple: you don't touch family. Elena wasn't just his old lady, she was the heart of the club, the one who patched up members after fights, who talked down hot-headed prospects, who made sure the club's charitable work in the community actually meant something. "You get a good look at the other two?" he asked finally. "Good enough," Elena said. "And Tommy, there's something else." When they ran off, I heard one of them mention a name: Ricky Castellano. Tommy's blood went cold. Ricky Castellano was small-time muscle for the Torino crime family, bottom-feeder scum who dealt drugs to high school kids and ran protection rackets on immigrant-owned businesses. If Castellano was behind this, it meant the attack on Elena wasn't random street crime. It was a declaration of war. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as Margaret stepped back inside, her face a mask of composed calm that would have fooled anyone who didn't know her well enough to catch the slight tremor in her hands. She slid back into the cracked vinyl booth across from Danny, who was still nursing his coffee and pretending to read yesterday's newspaper. "Everything all right out there?" he asked without looking up, though his knuckles had gone white around the coffee mug. "Fine," Margaret replied, smoothing her grey cardigan. "Just needed some air." Through the window, she could see the three men huddled around their motorcycles in the parking lot. The one who'd grabbed her, Tommy, she'd heard the others call him, was gesticulating wildly while his companions shook their heads. Even from this distance, she could read the body language. They wanted to leave, but Tommy's pride was wounded. Margaret had seen this dance before, too many times to count. Young men with something to prove and not enough sense to know when they were outmatched. The smart ones backed down, the stupid ones doubled down. Tommy looked like the doubling down type. "Margaret," Danny's voice was low, urgent. "My phone's been buzzing non-stop since you went outside. That was Jake, wasn't it?" She nodded, pulling her own phone from her purse. 17 missed calls, 23 text messages, all from the same number she knew by heart. Even after all these years. "Where are you?" "Maggie, answer me." "On my way." "Do not engage." That last one almost made her smile. Jake still thought he could give her orders like she was some helpless civilian instead of a woman who'd been handling bikers since before he got his first Harley. "He's coming," she told Danny, who paled slightly. "How long do we have?" Margaret checked the time. Given Jake's usual speed and complete disregard for traffic laws when family was involved, maybe 20 minutes. Probably less. "Not long enough," she murmured. Outside, Tommy had apparently won the argument with his friends. All three were walking back toward the diner with the particular swagger of men who'd convinced themselves they were tougher than they actually were. Margaret sighed and reached into her purse, past the phone and wallet, to the small leather pouch she always carried but rarely needed to use. "Margaret," Danny warned, recognizing the gesture, "don't do anything that'll make this worse." "Worse?" She looked at him with raised eyebrows. "Danny, honey, when Jake gets here, if these boys are still breathing, they'll be lucky. I'm trying to help them." The bell chimed again as the three bikers entered. The few other customers in the diner, an elderly trucker, a young couple sharing pie, the waitress behind the counter, all seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Conversations died. Silverware stopped clinking. Tommy swaggered over to their booth, his friends flanking him like backup dancers in some twisted music video. Up close, Margaret could see he was younger than she'd first thought. Maybe 25, with the kind of lean build that came from too much adrenaline and not enough food. His colors were crisp, new-looking. Fresh prospect, she realized. That explained the attitude. "We need to talk," he announced, sliding uninvited into the booth beside Margaret. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just studied him with the calm attention of someone examining an interesting but ultimately harmless insect. "I think we covered everything outside," she said mildly. "No, we didn't." Tommy leaned closer, and Margaret caught the scent of cheap cologne mixed with motor oil and fear sweat. "See, I made some calls. Asked around about this Jake character you threatened me with." Margaret's expression didn't change, but inside, ice began forming in her veins. Did you now? Turns out there's no Jake running anything around here. No chapter president, no big bad biker boss. Tommy's grin was all teeth and malice. You played me, old lady. Made me look like a fool in front of my brothers. One of his friends shifted uncomfortably. Tommy, maybe we should just... Shut up. Tommy's hand moved to Margaret's wrist, not quite grabbing but definitely threatening. I don't like being made a fool of. Margaret looked down at his hand, then back up at his face. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of being heard without having to shout. Son, she said softly, you have exactly 10 seconds to remove your hand before you learn just how wrong your information was. Outside, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines began to grow louder. Not one bike, or even a few. Many, growing closer. Tommy's grin faltered slightly, but he didn't move his hand. That's what I thought, he started to say. Then, the first Harley roared into the parking lot. The chrome and leather kingdom that was Jack Morrison's domain stretched across 3 acres of sun-baked asphalt on the outskirts of Riverside. The Reaper's compound wasn't just a clubhouse, it was a fortress, complete with razor wire, surveillance cameras, and enough firepower to outfit a small militia. At its heart sat Jack Morrison, a mountain of a man whose reputation preceded him into every room he'd entered for the past 25 years. Morrison's office occupied the entire 2nd floor of the main building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of his empire below. Members moved with purpose across the yard, their leather cuts bearing the distinctive skull and scythe patch that struck fear into rival clubs from San Diego to Sacramento. But today, the usual rhythm of club business felt distant to Morrison as he stared at the phone in his weathered hands. Sarah's voice had been steady when she called, almost casual as she recounted the morning's events at Mel's diner. She'd given him the facts in her typical no-nonsense manner. Some punk named Danny Reeves had made the mistake of putting his hands on her and threatening her life over a spilled cup of coffee. She'd handled it, she assured him, but thought he should know. Morrison set the phone down and walked to the window, his steel-toed boots silent on the thick carpet. Below, prospects washed bikes while full members discussed the finer points of engine modifications. Normal day, normal business. Except nothing felt normal when someone threatened the most important person in his world. The door opened behind him without a knock. Only one person in the club had that privilege. Tank Williams, Morrison's sergeant-at-arms and closest friend for over 2 decades, entered carrying 2 steaming cups of black coffee. At 6'6" and pushing 300 pounds, Tank had earned his nickname honestly. His loyalty to Morrison was absolute, their bond forged in blood and brotherhood through countless wars with rival clubs. Heard Sarah called, Tank said, setting 1 cup on Morrison's desk. Words already spreading. Morrison accepted the coffee without turning around. How much do they know? Enough. Some asshole threatened the old lady, put his hands on her. Tank's voice carried the edge of barely controlled violence. Boys are asking questions. What kind of questions? The kind that end with that punk disappearing into the desert. Morrison finally turned from the window, his ice-blue eyes meeting Tank's darker gaze. At 52, Morrison still cut an imposing figure. His salt-and-pepper beard was meticulously groomed, his muscled frame maintained through daily workouts and decades of hard living. Scars crisscrossed his knuckles and forearms, souvenirs from territorial wars and personal vendettas that had shaped the California biker landscape. Tell me about Danny Reeves, Morrison said, settling behind his desk. Tank pulled out his phone, scrolling through information that had been gathered with military efficiency. 26 years old, small-time dealer working the college scene. Thinks he's harder than he is. Got popped for assault 2 years back, but the charges were dropped. Word is he's been bragging around town about moving up, making bigger plays. Family? Mother in Oregon, no contact. Father's been in Pelican Bay for the last 15 years. No siblings, no wife, no kids. Morrison nodded slowly. In the hierarchy of justice that governed his world, these details mattered. A man with family deserved consideration, even if punishment was inevitable. A man alone faced different consequences entirely. He knew, Morrison said after a moment. Had to know who she was. Maybe. Or maybe he's just stupid enough to think it doesn't matter. The club president stood and walked to a wall-mounted map of California, its surface dotted with colored pins marking territory, allies and enemies. The Reapers' domain was vast, their influence reaching into legitimate businesses and underground networks that made them untouchable by conventional law enforcement. "Sarah doesn't want me to handle this," Morrison said without turning around. Since when does what Sarah wants matter when someone threatens Sarah? It was a fair question, one that struck at the heart of Morrison's dilemma. Sarah Caldwell had never asked to be an old lady. She'd never sought the protection or the problems that came with loving the president of the most feared motorcycle club in California, but she'd accepted both with the same quiet strength she brought to everything else in her life. She handled herself, Morrison continued, put him down hard from what she told me, made her point. And now he's walking around town, probably planning how to get even. You know how this works, brother. You let one punk slide, 10 more think they can try their luck. Morrison's reflection stared back at him from the window, a man caught between love and duty, between mercy and reputation. In his world, respect was currency, and debts of violence carried interest that compounded daily. The phone on his desk rang once before falling silent. Tank's grin was wolfish. That was Razor. Him and the boys just spotted Reeves's car pulling into Mickey's bar downtown. The rumble of 37 Harley-Davidsons echoed off the canyon walls as the Devil's Backbone Mac rolled through the mountain pass toward Barstow. Marcus Iron Rodriguez led the formation, his weathered hands steady on the handlebars, despite the rage burning in his chest. Behind him, his brothers rode in perfect formation, a steel river of chrome and leather cutting through the desert night. The call had come 3 hours ago. Betty's voice, calm as always, but Iron could hear the tremor underneath. Someone had put hands on his woman. Someone had made the mistake of threatening the one person in this world he'd kill for without hesitation. Thunder, his road captain, pulled alongside on Iron's left. Even through their helmets and the wind, they could communicate with hand signals developed over 2 decades of riding together. Thunder pointed to his phone, then made a cutting motion across his throat. The message was clear. Razor Eddie's crew had scattered like roaches when word spread about what happened at the diner. But Iron knew they wouldn't run far. Punks like Tommy Vasquez were all bluster and no brains. They'd hole up somewhere familiar, somewhere they felt safe. Probably that abandoned warehouse on the east side of Barstow where Eddie's boys dealt their low-grade meth to truckers and desperate locals. The convoy slowed as they approached the Barstow city limits. Iron raised his fist, and the formation tightened. This wasn't a Sunday ride anymore. This was war. The streetlights cast harsh shadows across their faces, transforming the Devil's Backbone into something primordial and terrifying. Iron's mind drifted to Betty, probably back at the clubhouse by now, fussed over by the old ladies who understood what it meant to be part of this family. She'd tell them she was fine, of course. His Betty was tougher than most men he'd known. But that wasn't the point. The point was respect, and some little shit had forgotten that actions had consequences. Mongoose, the club's enforcer, revved his engine twice, their signal for target acquired. Up ahead, the warehouse loomed against the star-scattered sky, yellow light spilling from its few unbroken windows. 3 cars sat in the gravel parking lot, a rusted Toyota, a stolen Camaro, and Razor Eddie's pride and joy, a purple Cadillac with spinning rims that screamed new money and no class. Iron held up his hand, and the convoy rolled to a stop 2 blocks away. Engines died one by one until only the desert wind remained. The silence was profound, pregnant with violence. They moved on foot, spreading out like wolves surrounding prey. Iron had done this dance 100 times before, but tonight felt different. Tonight was personal. The warehouse grew larger as they approached, and he could hear voices from inside, laughter, music, the casual arrogance of men who thought themselves untouchable. Thunder appeared beside him, carrying the canvas bag they'd brought from the clubhouse. Inside were the tools of their trade, tire irons, chains, brass knuckles, and Iron's personal favorite, a Louisville slugger he'd carved notches into over the years, not for kills, but for lessons taught and debts collected. The front door was steel, but the side entrance was just plywood and wishful thinking. Iron nodded to Diesel, a massive enforcer whose day job was demolition. The big man stepped forward and kicked. The door exploded inward, and suddenly the night erupted with shouts and scrambling footsteps. Iron stepped through the splintered doorframe like an avenging angel in leather and denim. The warehouse reeked of chemicals and fear. Card tables were overturned, poker chips scattered like confetti. 3 men dove for weapons while 2 more bolted for the back exit, only to run straight into the arms of Devil's Backbone members who'd been waiting. But Iron's eyes found only one target, Tommy Vasquez, pressed against the far wall with nowhere to run. His earlier bravado evaporated like morning mist. The kid couldn't be more than 25, all tattoos and attitude until this moment. Now he looked exactly like what he was, a small-time punk who'd stepped into a world where his daddy's money and connections meant less than nothing. "You remember me, boy?" Iron's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "More importantly, you remember my woman?" Tommy's mouth worked soundlessly, his eyes darting between Iron and the dozen bikers now surrounding him. Behind them, the warehouse had gone quiet, except for the soft sounds of Razor Eddie's other boys being efficiently subdued. Iron pulled the Louisville slugger from Thunder's bag, the wood worn smooth from years of use. "See, I got a problem," he continued, taking a step closer. "Some little shit thought he could put hands on what's mine, thought he could disrespect my family and walk away." The bat whistled as Iron took a practice swing, and Tommy flinched so hard he nearly fell. "Now," Iron said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout, "we're going to have ourselves a conversation about respect." The sunrise painted the desert sky in shades of amber and crimson as Margaret walked back to her Harley, each step measured and purposeful. Behind her, the roadside diner sat quiet, except for the soft clatter of dishes being cleared. The confrontation with Tommy Vega had ended exactly as she'd known it would, with him backing down, tail between his legs, scrambling to salvage what little dignity remained. She pulled her leather jacket tighter against the morning chill and checked her phone. 3 missed calls from Razor, 2 from Diesel. Word traveled fast in their world, faster than wildfire through dry brush. By now, every member of the Devil's Backbone would know what had happened at Millie's diner. Margaret straddled her bike and fired up the engine, the familiar rumble settling into her bones like a heartbeat. She had 40 miles of desert highway ahead of her before reaching the compound, 40 miles to think about what came next. Because this wasn't over. Men like Tommy Vega didn't simply fade away after public humiliation. They festered, plotted, looked for ways to reclaim their lost pride. The road stretched endlessly before her, heat mirages already beginning to shimmer despite the early hour. She opened the throttle and let the wind strip away the tension from her shoulders. This was her meditation, her church, just her, the machine, and the endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the wasteland. 20 minutes into the ride, she caught sight of the dust cloud in her mirrors. 2 vehicles, moving fast, gaining ground. Margaret didn't need to see the occupants to know who was behind her. Tommy's pride wouldn't let him walk away from last night, not when his reputation hung in the balance. She downshifted and gunned it, the Harley's engine responding with a throaty roar. The speedometer climbed past 80, then 90. The pursuing vehicles matched her pace, and she could make out the details now, a black pickup truck and a faded blue sedan, both filled with men she recognized from the diner's parking lot. A turnoff appeared ahead, an old mining road that snaked up into the rocky hills. Margaret took it without slowing, her rear wheel sliding slightly on the loose gravel before finding purchase. The truck followed, but the sedan hesitated, its driver clearly uncomfortable with the rough terrain. Good, better odds. The mining road climbed steeply, winding between boulder formations and scrub brush. Margaret knew these hills, had ridden them countless times over the years. Every curve, every potential hazard was mapped in her memory. The truck behind her wasn't so fortunate. She could hear its engine laboring, transmission hunting for the right gear as it struggled with the grade. She crested a rise and saw her opportunity. An old mining cut created a natural amphitheater in the rock, with only one way in or out. It would be a risk, potentially trapping herself, but sometimes the only way forward was straight through the danger. Margaret pulled into the cut and killed her engine, dismounting quickly. She positioned herself behind a large boulder and waited. The truck appeared moments later, dust billowing from its wheels as it skidded to a stop. 4 men climbed out, Tommy among them, all carrying the swagger of predators who thought they'd cornered their prey. "Should have minded your own business, lady," Tommy called out, his voice echoing off the rock walls. "Should have stayed home where old women belong." Margaret stepped out from behind the boulder, hands visible but ready. "You boys are making a mistake. Last chance to turn around and forget this ever happened." Tommy laughed, a harsh sound that spoke of too much meth and not enough sleep. "You think we're afraid of some bikers, old lady? You got lucky at the diner, had witnesses. Ain't nobody out here but us." One of his companions, a thin man with prison tattoos covering his arms, shifted nervously. "Tommy, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Rico. This bitch embarrassed us. Time she learned some respect." Margaret reached slowly into her jacket and pulled out her phone, holding it up so they could see the screen. "You see this? GPS tracker. Every member of my husband's club knows exactly where I am right now. You really want to explain to Razor Kane why his wife didn't make it home?" The mention of Razor's name had an immediate effect. Rico took a step backward, and one of the other men actually paled, but Tommy's pride had carried him too far to retreat now. Bluffing, he spat, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "Kane don't know where you are." As if summoned by his words, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines echoed through the canyon. Multiple bikes, growing louder by the second. Margaret smiled, cold and patient as winter. "Actually, he does. Has ever since I left the diner. See, when you've been married to a man like Razor for 23 years, you learn to take precautions." The sound of engines grew closer, reverberating off the canyon walls like thunder. "My husband doesn't like it when people threaten what's his." The chrome exhaust pipes of 37 Harley-Davidsons gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the truck stop, as the Devil's Backbone Mac rolled in like thunder made manifest. Tank's bike led the formation, its custom paint job catching the light as he guided his brothers into a perfect V formation in the parking lot. The rumble of engines created a symphony that made windows vibrate and dogs bark for miles around. Sarah watched from inside the diner as her husband dismounted his machine with the fluid grace of a man who'd been riding since before some of his prospects were born. Even at 52, Tank commanded respect through presence alone. His leather cut bore patches that told stories of blood, brotherhood, and battles won. The Death's Head insignia of the Devil's Backbone chapter caught the light as he strode toward the diner, his steel-toed boots echoing against the asphalt. Behind him, his brothers followed in order of rank. Razor, his sergeant-at-arms, moved like a wolf scanning for threats. His scarred face told the story of a man who'd earned his position through violence and loyalty in equal measure. Bones, the club's enforcer, cracked his knuckles as he walked, the sound like gunshots in the night air. Each man wore the same expression of controlled fury that had made their chapter legendary from San Francisco to the Mexican border. The diner's other customers pressed themselves against windows and booths, their conversations dying to whispers. The teenage cashier's hands shook as she pretended to clean coffee cups that were already spotless. Even the cook, a ex-Marine who'd seen action in 3 different wars, found reasons to stay in the kitchen. Tank pushed through the glass doors with enough force to make them slam against their frames. His eyes immediately found Sarah, and she saw the relief wash over his weathered features before the rage returned. In 3 long strides he was beside her booth, his massive hands gentle as they checked her face and arms for injuries. "You hurt, darling?" His voice carried the rasp of 1,000 cigarettes and 10,000 miles of road dust, but it was soft when he spoke to her. The contradiction wasn't lost on anyone in the room. This man could order executions with the same mouth that whispered endearments to his wife. "I'm fine, Tommy." Sarah used his given name deliberately, a reminder of the man beneath the legend. "Just shaken up a little." Tank's jaw tightened as his brothers spread throughout the diner like an occupying army. Razor positioned himself by the front door while Bones took the back exit. The rest of the chapter filled every available space, their presence transforming the humble roadside eatery into something that felt more like a courtroom where capital sentences were decided. "Where is he?" Tank's question was directed at Sarah, but his eyes scanned the room like a predator marking territory. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the network of scars that mapped his violent history. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat from his corner booth, his hand resting conspicuously away from his service weapon. The old lawman had survived 3 decades of keeping peace in a county where the Devil's Backbone chapter had deep roots. He knew when to fight and when to negotiate. "Tommy," Morrison said carefully, using the president's real name as Sarah had. "Your boy Danny's got him secured in my patrol car. No harm came to Sarah, and we've got everything documented proper." Tank nodded slowly, processing this information. His brothers waited for orders, their collective energy like a coiled spring ready to unleash hell on command. The diner held its breath as the most feared man in 3 counties decided how justice would be served. Through the windows, Danny Walker could be seen leading a handcuffed figure toward Sheriff Morrison's patrol car. Even at a distance, it was clear that Eddie Torino had learned some hard lessons about consequence in the short time since Tank's arrival. The street thug's swagger had been replaced by the shuffling gait of a man who'd glimpsed his own mortality. Tank's hand found Sarah's shoulder, his touch possessive but protective. 37 pairs of eyes watched their president, waiting for the word that would determine whether tonight ended with justice served through proper channels or through the brutal arithmetic of street vengeance. The air conditioning unit kicked on, its mechanical hum the only sound brave enough to break the silence. Outside, the neon sign advertising best coffee on I-5 flickered intermittently, casting red shadows across the assembled motorcycles like drops of blood on chrome and steel. Tank's decision would echo through the criminal underworld of California, reinforcing lessons about respect, consequence, and the terrible swift sword that protected those under the Devil's Backbone's umbrella. Some mistakes could be forgiven, others required payment in full. The reckoning had arrived, and everyone in that diner knew they were witnessing something that would become legend. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast harsh shadows across Marcus Webb's swollen face as he tried to focus on the police officer's questions. His left eye had swollen shut completely, and his jaw screamed with every attempt to speak. Through his good eye, he could see Detective Sarah Chen leaning forward, her pen poised over a notepad. "Run it by me one more time," Chen said, her voice carrying a mixture of skepticism and exhaustion. "You're telling me that an elderly woman orchestrated this beating?" Marcus winced as he shifted in the hospital bed. "I already told you what happened. That crazy old bat had me jumped by bikers." Chen exchanged a glance with her partner, Detective Rodriguez, who stood near the window. They'd been working cases in this part of California long enough to recognize the signs when someone had tangled with the angels. The methodical nature of the beating, the specific injuries designed to cause maximum pain without permanent damage. It all pointed to a very particular kind of message. "These bikers," Rodriguez interjected, "you get a good look at any of them? License plates? Anything we can work with?" Marcus's good eye darted between the 2 detectives. The truth was, he remembered fragments, leather vests, the sound of Harleys, and most clearly, the cold fury in the old woman's eyes as she'd watched them work him over. But talking to cops about the Hells Angels was signing his own death warrant. "It was dark," he mumbled. Happened too fast. Chen closed her notepad with a sharp snap. Mr. Webb, we both know you're not telling us everything. But without your cooperation, there's not much we can do here. As the detectives prepared to leave, Chen paused at the doorway. Word of advice? Whatever you did to earn this beating, I'd suggest you think real hard about whether you want to double down on that decision. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Marcus alone with the steady beep of monitors and the weight of his situation. His phone buzzed on the bedside table, a text from Tommy asking where he was. Marcus deleted it without responding. 3 floors up in the administrative offices, Dr. Patricia Holbrook was having her own difficult conversation. She sat across from the hospital's security chief, watching grainy footage from the parking lot cameras on his computer screen. There, she pointed. That's when they brought him in. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. On screen, 2 figures carried an obviously injured man between them toward the emergency entrance. The camera angle made it impossible to see faces clearly, but both men wore dark clothing and moved with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. They didn't stick around, the security chief noted. Dropped him at the door and vanished. Professional job. Dr. Holbrook had seen enough violence in her 20 years in emergency medicine to recognize patterns. Gang retaliation, domestic abuse, bar fights, they all left different signatures. This felt calculated, controlled. Someone had wanted Marcus Webb hurt but alive. Have the police seen this footage? She asked. Detective Chen requested copies. But honestly, Doc, there's not much here that'll help them. These guys knew where the cameras were. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, Eleanor sat in the kitchen of the clubhouse, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The adrenaline from the evening had finally faded, leaving behind a complex mix of satisfaction and unease. Through the window, she could see several angels working on bikes in the moonlit courtyard, their movements relaxed and unhurried. The door creaked open, and Diesel stepped inside, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. His massive frame filled the doorway as he studied Eleanor's expression. "You having second thoughts?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. Eleanor considered the question. "About tonight? No. That boy needed to learn consequences have weight. I'm just thinking about what comes next. Cops'll sniff around for a while, but Webb won't talk. He's stupid, but he's not suicidal." Diesel's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd navigated these waters many times before. "Question is whether he's smart enough to let it end here. And if he's not?" Diesel's expression hardened. "Then we'll have another conversation with him, a more permanent one." Eleanor nodded slowly. She understood the mathematics of respect and fear that governed this world. Tonight had been a warning, delivered with just enough force to make the message clear. But Marcus Webb struck her as the type who might mistake survival for victory, who might convince himself that he could find an angle to exploit. "There's something else," she said quietly. At the diner before all this started, he wasn't just being aggressive, he was scouting, looking for something or someone specific. Diesel's attention sharpened. "You sure about that? 20 years of watching people, reading their intentions, you develop instincts." He was hunting. Eleanor met Diesel's gaze. The question is what he was hunting for, and whether tonight's lesson will convince him to hunt somewhere else. Outside, the sound of Harleys filled the night air as riders returned from evening runs, their voices carrying stories and laughter across the compound. The sheriff's station had transformed into a war room by dawn. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red pins showing Viper positions and blue for law enforcement. Coffee cups and empty energy drink cans littered desks where deputies had worked through the night, coordinating with state police and federal agencies. Marcus stood before the assembled crowd of officers, his voice hoarse from hours of briefings and phone calls. "Intel suggests they're planning something big for tonight." Street cameras picked up at least 40 bikes moving through the county after midnight. "They're regrouping." Deputy Chen raised her hand. "What about the woman, Sarah Mitchell? Any word on her location?" Still nothing. Marcus rubbed his temples. Jake Mitchell's been unreachable since yesterday. We have to assume they're together, somewhere the Vipers can't touch them. What Marcus didn't know was that Sarah sat in a reinforced safe house 60 miles north, watching the same news reports that were making her stomach churn. The converted hunting cabin belonged to Tommy Wrench Morrison, the Angels' treasurer, who'd built it as a refuge during his own troubles with rival clubs years back. "This is my fault," she whispered to Jake, who was methodically cleaning his service weapon at the kitchen table. "If I'd just kept walking that night—" "Stop!" Jake's voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded respect on the streets for 2 decades. Rico Valdez made his choice when he put his hands on you. Everything that followed was his doing, not yours. Through the window, Sarah could see Angels patrolling the perimeter. These weren't the stereotypical bikers from movies. They moved with military precision, communicating through hand signals and maintaining overlapping fields of fire. Jake had explained that several were veterans, men who'd found brotherhood in the club after struggling to adjust to civilian life. "The Vipers won't find us here," Jake continued, sensing her anxiety. "But they will keep escalating until this ends. That's what cornered animals do." His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Diesel. The main chapter house was under surveillance, but the Vipers hadn't made their move yet. They were waiting for something. Meanwhile, in a warehouse on the outskirts of the county, Vincent Morales paced before his assembled soldiers. The space reeked of motor oil and cigarettes, weapons laid out on folding tables like a military armory. 37 Vipers had answered his call, including reinforcements from chapters in 3 neighboring states. Rico was family. Vincent's voice echoed off the concrete walls. "These Angels think they can humiliate us, kill our blood, and walk away. Tonight, we show them what happens when you mess with the Vipers." A younger member, barely out of his teens, raised his voice. "What about the cops? They've got roadblocks everywhere." Vincent's smile was cold. "Let me worry about the cops. We've got someone on the inside feeding us information. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late." The plan was simple in its brutality. Strike the Angels' clubhouse first, draw their forces there, then hit their businesses and safe houses simultaneously. Vincent had mapped every property linked to the motorcycle club, from their legitimate garage to the bar they frequented. The goal wasn't just revenge, it was complete destruction of their presence in the territory. Back at the sheriff's station, Marcus felt the familiar weight of impending disaster. His phone rang constantly with reports of suspicious activity, stolen vehicles, and weapons purchases. The FBI had offered support, but federal involvement would complicate everything. This was still his jurisdiction, his responsibility. "Sheriff," Deputy Rodriguez burst through the door. "We intercepted radio chatter. Sounds like they're moving tonight, but we can't pinpoint where." Marcus studied the map again, looking for patterns. The Vipers were smart, patient. They'd hit where it would hurt most while minimizing their own exposure. His finger traced possible routes, potential targets. Then it clicked. "They're not going after the clubhouse first," he said, reaching for his radio. "It's too obvious, too defended. They'll hit the garage, maybe the bar, draw the Angels out of their stronghold." He began issuing orders, repositioning units to cover the club's known hangouts. But even as his deputies mobilized, Marcus knew they were playing catch-up. The Vipers had planned this carefully, and they had advantages law enforcement couldn't match: desperation, local knowledge, and nothing left to lose. In the safe house, Jake received another message that made his jaw clench. Sarah watched his expression change, saw the careful mask slip for just a moment. "What is it?" "They found my bike," Jake said quietly. "Burned it in front of the clubhouse, along with a message." Sarah didn't need to ask what the message said. She could see it in her husband's eyes, the way his hands stilled on the weapon. The Vipers weren't just coming for him, they were coming for everything he'd built, everyone he'd sworn to protect. The war was about to begin in earnest, and there would be no walking away from what came next. The chrome exhaust pipes of 37 Harleys gleamed in the desert sun as the convoy rolled through Barstow like a mechanical stampede. Sarah sat behind Marcus on his Road King, her arms wrapped around his leather-clad torso, feeling the controlled fury radiating from his body. The familiar rhythm of the engine beneath them did nothing to calm the storm brewing in both their hearts. Behind them, the Crimson Riders chapter rode in tight formation, their colors flying proud in the hot wind. These weren't weekend warriors or posers. These were men who'd bled together, fought together, and would ride straight into hell together if Marcus gave the word. Today felt dangerously close to that scenario. Marcus had been silent for the last 50 miles, his jaw set in granite. Sarah knew that look. She'd seen it twice before in their 23 years together, once when a rival club had tried to muscle in on their territory, and once when someone had threatened their nephew at a school function. Both times, the aftermath had made headlines. As they approached the outskirts of Victorville, Marcus raised his left fist, signaling the convoy to slow. The pack moved like a single organism, engines downshifting in harmony. They pulled into an abandoned gas station, the asphalt cracked and sprouting weeds through the gaps. Tommy Hernandez, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, killed his engine and approached the Road King. His face bore the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much violence, but his loyalty to Marcus was absolute. "Boss, I got word from Psycho Pete about 20 minutes ago. Danny Kowalski's been asking around town, trying to hire muscle. Apparently, our boy's gotten smart enough to know he stepped in it deep." Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of controlled menace. Smart enough to know, but too stupid to run. "Where is he?" "Holed up at his cousin's auto shop on Industrial Boulevard. Pete says there's maybe 4 or 5 guys with him, probably strung out and desperate." Sarah dismounted and stretched her legs, her joints protesting after the long ride. Despite everything, she felt oddly calm. This was her world, had been for over 2 decades. She understood the rules, the code that governed these men. Danny Kowalski had violated something sacred, and now the debt had to be paid. "Marcus," she said quietly, drawing him aside. "You know I don't ask for much." He turned to her, his steel-grey eyes softening slightly. "Anything, baby. You know that. I want to be there when you talk to him. I need him to see my face, to understand what he really did." Marcus studied her for a long moment. In all their years together, Sarah had never asked to be present for club business. She stayed clear of the violence, understanding that her role was to be his anchor to a normal world, the place he returned to when the darkness threatened to consume him completely. "Sarah, this ain't gonna be pretty. This kid's scared, probably armed, definitely stupid. Things could go sideways real fast." She reached up and touched his bearded cheek. "I've been your old lady for 23 years, Marcus Steele. I've patched your wounds, buried our brothers, and stood by you through 3 federal investigations. You think some punk-ass kid is going to rattle me now?" Tommy chuckled despite himself. "She's got a point, boss. Hell, Sarah's scarier than half our prospects when she's riled up." The convoy remounted and rolled through Victorville's industrial district, drawing stares and causing conversations to die mid-sentence. The sound of 37 Harleys was like distant thunder, a promise of the storm approaching. They found the auto shop exactly where Psycho Pete said it would be, a run-down building with 3 bay doors, 2 of them shut tight. A handful of beat-up cars sat in the lot, and Sarah could see movement behind the grimy windows of the office. Marcus raised his fist again, and the convoy spread out, surrounding the building with military precision. These men had done this dance before. They knew how to cut off escape routes, how to project overwhelming force without firing a single shot. As Marcus and Sarah walked toward the office door, flanked by Tommy and 3 other chapter members, Sarah felt a strange sense of completion. She thought about the diner, about the fear in that young waitress's eyes, about the casual cruelty of Danny Kowalski's words. Some people went through life never understanding that actions had consequences, that respect wasn't just a word but a currency that kept the world from devolving into chaos. The office door was locked, but that lasted exactly as long as it took Tommy's size 12 boot to connect with the frame. Inside, they could hear scrambling, panic, the sound of a phone being dialed with shaking fingers. Marcus stepped through the splintered doorway, Sarah beside him, and called out in a voice that could cut through steel, "Danny, we need to talk, son. Time to pay your tab." The warehouse smelled of motor oil and fear. Mickey Torino hung from chains attached to an overhead beam, his face a patchwork of bruises and cuts. Blood dripped steadily from his split lip onto the concrete floor below. 3 days had passed since the Mongols delivered him to Snake's doorstep, and those 3 days had been educational for everyone involved. Snake circled him slowly, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. The president of the Devil's Disciples had removed his leather vest, revealing arms covered in tattoos that told the story of 30 years in the outlaw world. Each mark represented a victory, a loss, a brother fallen, or an enemy defeated. "You know what I find interesting, Mickey?" Snake's voice carried the rasp of a man who'd inhaled too much smoke and shouted over too many Harley engines. "You picked the wrong woman to mess with, but you also picked the wrong time to do it." Mickey's head lolled forward. He'd stopped trying to speak hours ago when Snake made it clear that listening was more important than talking. "See, my Beth, she's been having nightmares since you decided to play tough guy at Mel's diner. Wakes up in a cold sweat, thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't shown up." Snake took a long drag from his cigarette, the ember glowing bright in the dim warehouse light. "That bothers me, Mickey. That bothers me a whole hell of a lot." Across the warehouse, Diesel worked on his bike, the rhythmic sound of a wrench against metal providing an odd soundtrack to the proceedings. Other members of the club moved about their business, cleaning weapons, counting money from the week's collections, planning runs. This was just another Tuesday for the Devil's Disciples. Snake stubbed out his cigarette on a nearby workbench and picked up a pair of pliers. The tool felt familiar in his hands, worn smooth by years of mechanical work and other, less pleasant applications. "Now I could kill you," Snake said conversationally. "Would be easy enough. Clean up the mess, feed you to the desert. Nobody would ever find you, and frankly, nobody would look too hard. Small-time punks like you disappear every day." He set the pliers down and reached for something else, a photograph. It was the picture Beth carried in her wallet, the one of them on their wedding day 15 years ago. She'd been so beautiful that day, radiant in a simple white dress, her hand intertwined with his as they stood beside his Harley. "Killing you would be too easy," Snake continued. "See, Beth made me promise something after we got married. Made me swear that I wouldn't let the club business turn me into someone she couldn't recognize. She said she fell in love with a man who protected people, not just someone who hurt them." Mickey raised his head slightly, hope flickering in his swollen eyes. "Don't get excited," Snake said, catching the movement. "I'm not letting you go. But I am going to give you a choice, and that choice is going to teach you something about consequences." He walked over to a table covered with various tools and picked up a hammer. The weight felt good in his hand. Solid, reliable, final. "Option 1. I use this hammer to make sure you never walk right again. Break every bone below your knees. Let you live the rest of your life remembering what happens when you threaten innocent people. You'll be a cripple, but you'll be breathing." Snake set the hammer down and picked up a hunting knife, its blade gleaming under the warehouse's fluorescent lights. "Option 2. I carve my club's initials into your chest, right over your heart, deep enough to scar, painful enough that you'll feel it every time you breathe for the next few months, then the first turn you loose. But not before every criminal crew from here to San Francisco knows exactly what you did and exactly what happened to you because of it." He put the knife down and faced Mickey directly. "Option 3, you disappear, tonight, forever. Leave California and never come back. Change your name, change your life, become someone different. Because if I ever see you again, if I ever hear that you've hurt another innocent person, I won't give you choices next time." The warehouse fell quiet except for the distant sound of traffic on the interstate. Even Diesel had stopped working, waiting to see how this would play out. "Here's the thing about respect," Snake said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. It's not something you can demand. It's not something you can take by threatening people weaker than you. Real respect comes from how you handle yourself when nobody's watching, from the choices you make when you think there won't be consequences. He moved closer to Mickey, close enough that the hanging man could smell the leather and tobacco that clung to Snake's clothes. So, what's it going to be, Mickey? Hammer, knife, or highway? The question hung in the air like smoke, waiting for an answer that would determine whether Mickey Torino lived or died. The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain as Sarah adjusted her blazer and checked her watch. Danny's arraignment was scheduled for 9 sharp, and despite everything he'd put her through, she felt compelled to be there. Not for him, but for the closure she desperately needed. Marcus emerged from the black sedan, his massive frame cutting an imposing silhouette against the grey sky. He'd insisted on accompanying her, though they both knew the club's presence at a courthouse was rarely welcome. Today, however, their lawyer had advised that a show of unified support might work in their favor when the media inevitably picked up the story. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked, offering his arm as they climbed the wet steps. Sarah nodded, though her stomach churned with each step. "I need to see his face when they read the charges. I need him to see mine." The courthouse lobby buzzed with the usual morning chaos, lawyers clutching coffee and case files, defendants looking nervous in ill-fitting suits, family members huddled together in worried clusters. Sarah spotted Danny's mother near the information desk, her weathered face etched with a mixture of shame and defiance. Their eyes met briefly before the older woman looked away. Courtroom 3B was smaller than Sarah had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh relief. She and Marcus took seats in the back row, drawing curious glances from other spectators. Word had already begun to spread about the case. Small-town drama involving bikers was always good for local gossip. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Patricia Hawkins, a stern woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair, surveyed the room with practiced efficiency. Sarah had researched her extensively. Hawkins had a reputation for being tough but fair, with little patience for violence against women. When they brought Danny in, Sarah's breath caught. Gone was the cocky swagger she remembered from that night at the diner. He'd lost weight, and his orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. His eyes darted nervously around the courtroom until they found hers. For a moment, neither looked away. Sarah saw something she hadn't expected, genuine fear. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman named Jennifer Walsh, stood to read the charges. Her voice carried clearly through the small courtroom as she detailed each count: assault and battery, attempted sexual assault, threatening behavior, destruction of property. Each word felt like vindication to Sarah, though she kept her expression neutral. Danny's court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man who couldn't have been older than 30, fidgeted with his papers. During their brief conversation before the hearing, he'd made it clear that Danny's best hope was a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming, and the victim's connections to the motorcycle club had only made the prosecutor more determined to pursue maximum penalties. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Hawkins asked. Danny stood slowly, his shackles clanking. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Sarah felt Marcus tense beside her. They'd expected this. Danny's mother had apparently been feeding him false hope about beating the charges. She'd convinced him that Sarah's association with the club would somehow work against her credibility, that a jury would never believe a biker's wife over a local boy. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The prosecutor wasted no time presenting the evidence. Security footage from the diner played on a small monitor, showing Danny's aggressive approach and Sarah's attempts to de-escalate. The audio was crystal clear, capturing his crude propositions and increasingly violent threats. Sarah watched several jury members visibly recoil at Danny's words. Next came the physical evidence. Photos of Sarah's torn clothing, the overturned table, Danny's own injuries from Marcus's intervention. The prosecutor painted a picture of a young man who'd felt entitled to whatever he wanted, regardless of consent or consequences. Sarah's testimony was scheduled for the following day, but she could already see the case's trajectory. Danny's lawyer tried desperately to poke holes in the evidence, suggesting that Sarah had somehow provoked the encounter or that her husband's reputation had influenced the investigation. Each argument fell flatter than the last. During a brief recess, Sarah stepped outside for air. The rain had stopped, but dark clouds still dominated the sky. She found herself thinking about the woman she'd been before that night, more trusting, less aware of the casual violence that some men felt entitled to inflict. Danny had changed her, but not in the way he'd intended. Instead of making her a victim, he'd revealed a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Marcus joined her on the courthouse steps, lighting a cigarette despite the no-smoking signs. "Jury's already made up their minds," he observed. "Kid's going down hard." Sarah nodded, watching Danny's mother hurry past them toward her car. The older woman's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs, and for a moment Sarah felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. Whatever Danny had become, he'd started as someone's beloved child. That tragedy didn't excuse his actions, but it reminded Sarah that justice, even when served, rarely brought the satisfaction people expected. Tomorrow would bring her moment to speak, to tell her story in her own words. Tonight, she would prepare for that reckoning. The warehouse on the outskirts of Bakersfield had been abandoned for years, its corrugated metal walls bearing the scars of time and neglect. Perfect for what needed to happen next. Tommy Castellano hung suspended from chains attached to the steel rafters, his feet barely touching the oil-stained concrete floor. Blood dripped steadily from his split lip, each drop echoing in the cavernous space. Reaper stood before him, rolling up his sleeves with methodical precision. The chapter president's face remained impassive, but his eyes burned with a cold fury that made Tommy's bladder threaten to release. Behind Reaper, a dozen devil's disciples formed a semicircle, their leather vests creaking as they shifted restlessly. They'd been riding for 6 hours straight to get here, following the trail that had led them to Tommy's pathetic hideout in a Motel 6. "You made a mistake, boy." Reaper's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of an avalanche. "You put your hands on something that don't belong to you." Tommy tried to speak, but only managed a wet cough. One of his teeth felt loose, courtesy of Axel's enthusiastic greeting when they'd kicked down his motel room door. I didn't know, man. I swear I didn't know who she was." Reaper's backhand snapped Tommy's head to the side. "That ain't the point. The point is, you thought you could take what you wanted from a woman who couldn't fight back. That makes you a special kind of coward." The chains clinked as Tommy swayed, trying to focus through the haze of pain. His vision kept blurring, making the bikers around him look like demons emerging from shadows, which, he supposed, wasn't far from the truth. "Please," Tommy gasped. "I got money. I can pay you." Reaper laughed, a sound like grinding gears. "Money? Son, you couldn't afford the interest on what you owe." He picked up a crowbar from a rusted workbench, testing its weight. "See my old lady, she's got a tender heart. She actually felt bad about what's going to happen to you. Can you believe that? After what you did, she was worried about your mama crying over your grave." Tommy's eyes widened as the crowbar caught a shaft of sunlight streaming through a broken window. Wait. I can give you information. I know things." "What kind of things?" Reaper paused, crowbar resting against his shoulder. "The serpents. I know about their next shipment. Heroin coming up from Mexico, worth millions." The warehouse fell silent except for the distant rumble of traffic on Highway 99. Reaper exchanged a glance with Ghost, who stepped forward from the circle of bikers. "When and where?" Ghost's voice carried the authority of the chapter's enforcer. Tommy licked his bloody lips. "Next Tuesday, they're using the old marina near Port Hueneme, container ship from Ensenada." The words tumbled out faster now, desperation making him reckless with secrets that would normally cost him his life to reveal. "Miguel Santos is running point. They think nobody knows about it." Reaper set the crowbar down, pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. He hit a number and waited. "It's me. Yeah, we got him. Listen, he's singing about a serpent operation. Heroin, Port Hueneme." He paused, listening. Tuesday night container ship. Santos is the contact. While Reaper talked, Tommy hung there trying to calculate his odds of survival. The Serpents were the devil's disciples' biggest rivals in the drug trade, controlling most of the Mexican pipeline into Southern California. If his information was good, maybe they'd keep him breathing long enough to... "Here's what's gonna happen," Reaper said, ending his call and picking up the crowbar again. "We're gonna verify your little story. If it checks out, you might live to see Christmas. If you're lying to me..." He let the crowbar tap against Tommy's kneecap, just hard enough to send a spike of agony up his leg. "Well, let's just say your death won't be quick." Tommy nodded frantically. "It's good intel, I swear on my mother's grave. Santos has been bragging about it for weeks. Says it's enough product to flood the whole coast." Axel stepped up to Reaper's shoulder. "Want me to make some calls? I got contacts at the Port Authority." "Do it, and get Diesel to run surveillance on Santos. I want to know if this piece of shit is playing us." Reaper's attention returned to Tommy. "You better hope this pans out, boy. Because if it don't, I'm going to introduce you to some creative uses for that crowbar." The warehouse door opened with a screech of rusted hinges, and Bones walked in carrying a laptop bag. "Got the portable setup, boss. Ready to start making calls." Tommy watched as the bikers transformed from a lynch mob into a military operation, their casual brutality giving way to focused professionalism. He realized with growing horror that these men weren't just thugs, they were businessmen who happened to traffic in violence and fear, and he'd just become their newest asset. The rumble of 30 Harley engines echoed through the canyon as Marcus's crew rolled toward the rendezvous point. The old mining road stretched ahead like a scar across the desert landscape, leading to an abandoned quarry that had seen more blood than ore in recent years. Marcus gripped his handlebars tighter, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him like the desert heat. Sarah sat behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, saying nothing. She'd been quiet since they left the clubhouse, lost in thoughts he couldn't read. The guilt gnawed at him. This was his fault, his responsibility to handle. But she'd made it clear she wouldn't be left behind, not when Tommy Vega had made it personal. The quarry came into view as they crested a hill, a gaping wound in the earth surrounded by rusted equipment and forgotten dreams. Marcus raised his fist, signaling the convoy to slow. Through his binoculars he could see vehicles already positioned along the rim, black SUVs and motorcycles, at least 40 men. Tommy had brought an army. "They're early," Diesel growled, pulling up alongside Marcus. "Want me to circle around? Check for an ambush?" Marcus studied the terrain. The quarry offered good sightlines but limited escape routes. Classic setup for a trap. Take 5 men and sweep the perimeter. Radio contact only. If this goes sideways, you get Sarah out of here. "Marcus," Sarah started to protest. "This isn't negotiable," he said, not turning around. "You wanted to come, but you follow my lead." She squeezed his waist once, acknowledging the terms. 20 minutes later, Diesel's voice crackled through the radio. "Perimeter's clean. They've got spotters on the high ground, but no immediate flanking positions. Looks like Tommy actually wants to talk." Marcus wasn't buying it. Tommy Vega didn't build his reputation on honest negotiations, but they'd come too far to back down now. "We go in. Formation Delta. Sarah, you stay in the middle." The Angels descended into the quarry in a precise 5 formation, engines echoing off the rock walls like thunder. Tommy's crew waited at the bottom, their leader standing beside a gleaming black Escalade. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the cocky smile that had gotten Tommy out of more trouble than it had caused, until now. They stopped 50 feet apart, engines still running. Marcus dismounted slowly, deliberately, his hands visible but ready. Behind him, his brothers formed a semicircle, each man positioned to cover multiple angles. Sarah remained on the bike, her eyes scanning the opposition with the same tactical awareness that had first drawn him to her. Tommy stepped forward, arms spread in mock welcome. "Marcus Kane, in the flesh. And you brought the little lady who caused all this fuss. How sweet. You called this meeting, Vega. Talk. Straight to business. I like that." Tommy's smile widened, revealing gold teeth that caught the afternoon sun. "Here's the deal. Your wife humiliated me in front of my boys, made me look weak. In my line of work, reputation is everything." "Your boy Jake learned that lesson the hard way," Marcus replied. "This could have ended there." "Could've, would've, should've," Tommy shrugged. "But it didn't. See, I can't let this slide. Sets a bad precedent. So I'm offering you a choice." Marcus said nothing, waiting. "Option 1. Your wife apologizes, publicly, on her knees. Maybe throws in a little something extra for my trouble. We call it even." The desert wind picked up, carrying dust and the scent of violence. Behind Marcus, he heard the subtle shift of leather and metal as his brothers prepared for what was coming. "Option 2? Marcus asked, his voice deadly calm. "Option 2 is messier, much messier. See, I've got 30 men here and you've got what, 25? Plus, I know where your clubhouse is, where your boys' families live, where little Sarah here works at that veterinary clinic." Tommy's smile turned predatory. "Accidents happen all the time." Sarah's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but Marcus heard it. The temperature around him seemed to drop 20 degrees despite the desert heat. This wasn't just about respect anymore. It was about everything he held sacred. "That's your offer?" Marcus asked. "That's my offer. You've got 60 seconds to decide." Marcus looked back at Sarah, then at his brothers. Each face reflected the same grim determination he felt in his bones. They'd known this moment would come eventually. In their world, it always did. He turned back to Tommy, his decision already made. "I've got a counter-offer for you, Vega. I'm listening. You and your boys turn around, ride out of here, and never show your face in our territory again. You forget Sarah exists. You forget we exist. And maybe, just maybe, you get to keep breathing." Tommy laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the quarry walls. "That's not how this works, Kane. You're outnumbered and outgunned." Marcus smiled for the first time since arriving. "Am I?" The sound of approaching motorcycles grew louder, their rumble echoing off the canyon walls like distant thunder. Marcus pressed himself against the cold concrete of the abandoned overpass, his wounded shoulders screaming in protest. Blood seeped through his fingers as he tried to apply pressure to the bullet graze, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. 3 days. He'd been running for 3 goddamn days since everything went sideways at the diner. What should have been a simple shakedown for gas money had turned into a nightmare that wouldn't end. The woman, Sarah, he'd heard them call her, hadn't looked like much, just another tired face behind the counter of a nowhere truck stop. How was he supposed to know she was connected to the Devil's Brotherhood? The engines grew closer, their deep bass notes vibrating through his chest. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to think. The smart play would be to turn himself in to the cops, but word on the street was that the Brotherhood had friends everywhere. Even locked up, he wouldn't be safe. Tank Morrison's reach extended far beyond the club's territory. A memory flashed through his mind. Sarah's face when he'd grabbed her wrist and demanded the register money. She hadn't looked scared. That should have been his first warning. Instead of fear, there had been something else in her eyes. Disappointment, maybe. Like she'd seen this dance too many times before. "You don't want to do this, son," she had said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made the other customers go silent. But Marcus had been too high on his own desperation to listen, too focused on the empty gas tank outside and the empty wallet in his pocket to recognize the danger. The motorcycle sounds faded slightly, heading toward the main road. Marcus allowed himself to breathe, but he knew it was temporary. They were methodical, these bikers. They'd search every inch of the area until they found him. Tank Morrison hadn't built his reputation by letting threats to his family slide. Marcus had done his homework after that first night when they'd come to his apartment. Tank Morrison, 62 years old, president of the Devil's Brotherhood for over 2 decades. The man was a legend. Not the kind you wanted to meet, but the kind whose stories got told in hushed voices in dive bars across the state. He'd started with nothing and built an empire that stretched from San Francisco to the Mexican border, and Marcus had threatened his woman. The irony wasn't lost on him. All those years of small-time hustles, careful to never step on the wrong toes, never cross the wrong people. One moment of desperation had brought down the wrath of the most dangerous man in California. His phone buzzed. Marcus stared at the unknown number, knowing he shouldn't answer but unable to stop himself. The voice that came through was gravelly, worn smooth by decades of cigarettes and whiskey. "Marcus." Tank's voice was calm, almost conversational. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "I didn't know," Marcus whispered into the phone. "I swear I didn't know who she was. But you knew she was somebody's woman, somebody's daughter, somebody's mother." There was a pause, and Marcus could hear the distant sound of engines in the background. "See, that's your problem, son. You think this is about disrespecting me. It ain't. It's about disrespecting her." Marcus pressed harder against the concrete, as if he could somehow melt into it and disappear. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something. Sarah's been serving coffee and kindness to truckers and travelers for 15 years. Never hurt nobody, never asked for trouble. She's the kind of woman who slips 20s to kids who can't pay for their meals. You know what she told me when I found out what happened?" Marcus waited, not trusting his voice. "She asked me not to hurt you, said you looked desperate, not evil, that maybe you just needed help instead of punishment." Tank's voice hardened. "But that was before you ran, before you made this into something bigger than it had to be." The sound of motorcycles was getting closer again, and Marcus realized they'd been triangulating his position during the call. Smart, professional. These weren't just angry bikers, they were hunters. "Here's what's going to happen," Tank continued. "You're going to come out from wherever you're hiding. You're going to face this like a man instead of a scared rabbit. And maybe, just maybe, we can end this without putting you in the ground." Marcus looked down at his bloody hand, at the burner phone that had become his lifeline and his doom. In the distance, he could see headlights cutting through the darkness, moving with purpose. The net was closing, and he was out of places to run. The phone crackled with static as Tank's voice came through one final time. "Your choice, son. Easy way or hard way. But this ends tonight." The warehouse smelled of motor oil and old concrete, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the cavernous space. Motorcycles lined the walls like sleeping steel predators, their chrome gleaming despite the dim lighting. Marcus knelt in the center of the room, his wrists zip-tied behind his back, blood trickling from his split lip where Tank had demonstrated the club's hospitality. Sarah sat in a metal folding chair 15 feet away, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that Bones had brought her. She watched Marcus with the same calm expression she'd worn at the diner, as if studying an interesting but ultimately insignificant specimen. "You comfortable, sweetheart?" Reaper's voice carried genuine concern as he approached her chair. The president of the Devil's Mercy MC still wore his leather cut, the patches telling a story of violence and loyalty that Marcus was only beginning to understand. "I'm fine, baby." Sarah's voice was steady, almost gentle. "Really?" Marcus lifted his head, confusion cutting through his fear. The woman he'd threatened, the one who'd seemed so vulnerable and alone, was talking to the most dangerous man in the room like they were discussing weekend plans. The casual intimacy between them was more terrifying than any weapon. "Good." Reaper's hand settled on Sarah's shoulder, a protective gesture that made every muscle in Marcus's body tense. "Because our friend here needs to understand some things before we proceed." Tank cracked his knuckles nearby, the sound echoing off the warehouse walls. "Want me to explain it to him, Prez?" "No." Sarah set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "I think he needs to hear this from me." She stood slowly, her movements unhurried despite the 20-plus bikers surrounding them. Marcus had noticed the way they all watched her, not with the predatory interest he'd expected, but with something approaching reverence. Even the prospects, young men barely out of their teens with fresh bruises and hungry eyes, straightened when she passed. "Do you know what you did wrong today, Marcus?" Sarah stopped just outside his reach, her tone almost maternal. I was just trying to get money for my girl's medicine." The lie tumbled out reflexively, the same sob story that had worked on softer marks. The backhand came from nowhere, Sarah's palm connecting with his cheek hard enough to snap his head sideways. Stars exploded across his vision, and when his sight cleared, she was still standing in the same spot, her expression unchanged. Wrong answer. She flexed her fingers absently. Try again. Marcus tasted copper, his tongue probing the fresh cut inside his mouth. Around the warehouse, the bikers had gone completely still, watching the scene with the focused attention of men witnessing a master class. "I threatened you," he whispered, getting warmer. "But you're still missing the point." Sarah began to pace in a slow circle around him. "See, you looked at me and saw what you wanted to see. A weak old woman traveling alone. Easy prey." Her footsteps echoed in the silence, measured and deliberate. "You never thought to wonder why I wasn't afraid, why I didn't flinch when you pulled that little knife, why I sat there drinking my coffee like nothing had happened." Marcus's breathing grew shallow. The zip ties cut into his wrists as he tried to shift position, but there was nowhere to go, no escape from the slow, methodical destruction of his worldview. "You want to know the truth?" Sarah stopped directly in front of him again. "I've buried 3 husbands, lost 2 sons to gang violence, watched more good men die than you've probably met in your entire worthless life. You think a punk like you with a gas station knife is going to make me tremble?" She knelt down until they were eye level, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But that's not even the worst part of your mistake. The worst part is that you threatened me in front of witnesses, in front of people who know exactly who I am and what I mean to this family." Reaper's boot scraped against concrete as he stepped closer, his presence looming like a storm front. 27 years, Sarah continued, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "That's how long I've been with my husband. 27 years of watching him build something that commands respect from here to Mexico. And you thought you could walk into our world and take what you wanted without consequences." Marcus finally understood why the bikers had gone so still, why even the biggest and most scarred among them watched Sarah with something approaching awe. She wasn't just Reaper's old lady, she was the heart of something vast and dangerous, the queen of a kingdom built on chrome and violence. "So, here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, rising to her feet with fluid grace. "You're going to learn exactly what respect means in our world. And if you're very, very lucky, you might live long enough to remember the lesson." She stepped back, nodding to her husband. "He's all yours, baby." The warehouse smelled of motor oils, cigarettes, and something darker, fear. Marcus Torino hung suspended from rusted chains, his expensive suit torn and bloodied, designer shoes scraping uselessly against the concrete floor. What remained of his crew knelt in a line against the far wall, hands zip-tied behind their backs, watching their boss swing like a broken pendulum. Thunder walked a slow circle around the suspended man, each footstep echoing in the cavernous space. The president of the Devil's Crossroads MC had removed his leather vest, revealing arms covered in tattoos that told stories of violence spanning 3 decades. His knuckles were split and bleeding, but he showed no signs of slowing down. "You still don't get it, do you?" Thunder's voice was gravelly from years of shouting over Harley engines and cigarette smoke. He stopped directly in front of Marcus, close enough that the drug dealer could smell the whiskey on his breath. "This ain't about territory. This ain't about business. You put your hands on something that belongs to me." Marcus spat blood, trying to summon whatever remained of his defiance. "That dried-up old bitch, she's nothing special, just some—" The punch came before he could finish the sentence. Thunder's right cross connected with surgical precision, snapping Marcus's head back and sending fresh blood spattering across the concrete. Several of his crew members flinched at the sound of impact. "Her name," Thunder said, shaking out his hand, "is Margaret. Mrs. Richardson to you, and she's more woman than you'll ever deserve to breathe the same air as." The warehouse doors groaned open, letting in a shaft of late-afternoon sunlight. Diesel walked in, followed by Hawk and 3 other Devil's Crossroads members. They moved with the casual confidence of men who owned whatever space they occupied. "Cops are asking questions downtown," Diesel reported, lighting a cigarette. "Nothing specific yet, but word's getting around that someone took out Marcus's street operation." Thunder nodded without taking his eyes off his prisoner. They'd been methodical in dismantling Marcus's network over the past week. Distribution points raided, dealers scattered to the wind, money seized. It had been surgical, professional, and absolutely devastating. "What about the Torino family?" Thunder asked. "Old man Torino's keeping his distance," Hawk said. "Word is he's not looking to start a war over his nephew's stupidity. Kid was always more liability than asset." Marcus's head lolled forward, consciousness coming and going like a tide. When he managed to focus his eyes again, Thunder was holding something that made his blood run cold, a rusty pair of bolt cutters. "See, Marcus, I've been thinking about proportional response," Thunder said, testing the tool's grip with a metallic snap. "You threatened to cut my woman. Seems only fair I return the favor." "Wait!" Marcus's voice cracked, all pretense of toughness evaporating. "Wait, please. I can make this right. Money, territory, whatever you want. My uncle—" "Your uncle's already written you off." Thunder's smile was colder than a morgue slab. Funny how family loyalty goes right out the window when the price gets too high. The warehouse fell silent except for Marcus's ragged breathing and the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. Thunder studied the bolt cutters like a surgeon examining his instruments. "You know what the worst part is?" Thunder continued. "Margaret actually felt bad about this. Said maybe we were going too far, maybe you were just some punk kid who didn't know better." He looked up, meeting Marcus's terrified eyes. "But see, I know better. Guys like you don't learn. You just get more careful about who you pick on." "Please," Marcus whispered. "I'll disappear. Leave the state. You'll never see me again." Thunder considered this for a long moment, tilting his head like he was actually weighing the offer. Then he shook his head slowly. "Problem is, disappearing ain't the same as understanding, and I need you to understand something real clear before we're done here." He raised the bolt cutters. "Actions have consequences, always." The scream that echoed through the warehouse would haunt Marcus's surviving crew members for years to come. It was the sound of a man learning exactly what those consequences looked like. When silence returned, Thunder wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked over to where Marcus's men knelt against the wall. They stared up at him with the wide-eyed terror of children who'd just witnessed something that would reshape their understanding of the world. "You boys are going to spread the word," Thunder said calmly. "Anybody touches Margaret Richardson, anybody even looks at her wrong, this is what happens. Are we clear?" The nods came fast and frantic, heads bobbing like dashboard ornaments. "Good." Thunder picked up his vest and shrugged it on. "Cut 'em loose, Diesel. Let them carry their boss to whatever hospital will take him." As the Devil's Crossroads filed out of the warehouse, Thunder paused at the door for one last look at Marcus, who hung unconscious in his chains, forever changed. Some lessons, Thunder reflected, really were learned the hard way. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Mel's Diner, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Sarah stood beside Jake's Harley, her fingers tracing the chrome handlebars as she watched the last of the police cars disappear down the highway. The silence felt almost surreal after the chaos of the past 24 hours. "You sure you're okay?" Jake asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. His voice carried the weight of everything they'd been through, the fear he'd felt when he first got that call, the rage that had consumed him, and now the overwhelming relief. Sarah leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I'm more than okay," she said softly. "I'm alive, and Tommy Rourke will never hurt anyone again." The sound of approaching motorcycles rumbled in the distance, growing louder until a convoy of Harleys pulled into the parking lot. The brothers had returned, their faces showing a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. Danny dismounted first, pulling off his helmet and running a hand through his graying hair. "It's done," he said simply. "Every last one of Rourke's crew that was involved is either dead or in custody. The ones who surrendered are singing like canaries to save their own skins." Marcus nodded, his usual stoic expression softened by something that might have been admiration. Words already spreading through the underground. Nobody's going to mess with the serpents or their families for a long time. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. Justice had been served, but the cost had been high. She thought about Tommy Rourke's final moments, the look in his eyes when he realized his mistake. Part of her felt pity for him, despite everything he'd put her through. But mostly, she felt grateful to be surrounded by people who would move heaven and earth to protect her. "What happens now?" she asked, turning in Jake's arms to face him. Jake's weathered face broke into a smile, the first genuine one she'd seen from him since this whole ordeal began. "Now we go home. We rebuild what needs rebuilding, and we remember why family matters more than anything else." Mel emerged from the diner, wiping his hands on his apron. The old man had seen more than his share of violence over the years, but the events of the past day had shaken him. He approached the group with hesitant steps. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I want you to know what you did in there, standing up to that animal. That took real courage. You saved lives." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Mel shook his head firmly. "Most people would have frozen, would have given him what he wanted and hoped for the best. You fought back, and you gave these boys the time they needed to get here. You're a hero in my book." Danny stepped forward, his expression serious. "Sarah, the Brotherhood has a tradition. When someone proves themselves in battle, when they show they're willing to stand and fight for the family, we don't forget. You've earned something today that can't be taken away." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small silver pendant, a serpent coiled around a motorcycle wheel, the club's emblem. But this one was different, more delicate, clearly crafted specifically for a woman. "This isn't just Jake's old lady we're talking about anymore," Danny continued, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. "This is our sister, our family. Anyone who messes with her messes with all of us, forever and always." Jake's arms tightened around her as Danny placed the pendant in her palm. The silver was warm, almost alive in her fingers. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, men who had risked everything to save her, who had treated her not as a burden to be protected, but as family worth fighting for. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Don't say anything," Jake murmured against her ear. "Just know that you're home, really home." The rumble of engines filled the air again as the brothers began mounting their bikes. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning mist, and the highway beckoned. There would be funerals to attend, repairs to make, and the long process of healing from the wounds this war had opened. But for now, there was just this moment, Sarah clutching the pendant that marked her as family, Jake's arms around her, and the open road stretching ahead of them. As she climbed onto the back of Jake's Harley and wrapped her arms around his waist, she realized that she'd found something she'd never expected in this world of leather and chrome and violence. She'd found where she belonged. The convoy pulled out onto the highway, engines roaring in harmony, carrying them toward whatever came next. Behind them, Mel's diner stood quiet in the morning sun, witness to the end of one story and the beginning of another.